Hello, and welcome to Meet the Author with Layman Library. I'm Derek, and joining me today is Amelia Loken. Ms. Loken is the daughter of a children's librarian and was practically raised in a library. She has worked as an ASL English interpreter in educational, medical, and community settings to represent clients who have disabilities. When her hearing loss started, she transferred into the field of access technology. As an author, she writes about characters with disabilities. In her new book, Unravel, she writes about Marguerite, a deaf princess with a maimed hand who uses magic through embroidery. She's here today to share her insights and experience as an author and to read a segment from her new book, Unravel. Thank you for joining us today. It is a pleasure. Let me say that from the very beginning. It is a pleasure, so thank you. Yes. Briefly, tell the audience a little bit about your book.
All right, so my book is called Unravel, mostly because Marguerite uses embroidery magic. And in the book, we call it skein craft. So like a skein of yarn or a skein of thread is called skein craft in this culture. And she is called a skein witch. But she has been hiding it because her uncle, who is just behind her in procession to who can get the throne, he has become the bishop princeps. So he is the religious leader of the kingdom, and he is having an all-out war on magic. And so she hides that part of her, but everything comes to pieces. And so she, even though she's not trained in magic, she's got to figure out how to get that magical training and have the courage to step out of the shadows to face her uncle, who has a definite plan for taking power.
Okay, all right. Now, is it all right if I use the word sign language or the expression
Yes,
sign language?
absolutely.
All right. Now, in your book, you use sign language as dialogue. How do you put it into print? How do you write that in a book? Because from the manuscripts that I've seen online, I didn't see any hand signs in the transcripts. So explain that to the audience.
That's a really good question. So as I was writing this, I have a background in sign language and in American Sign Language, so that's my training, but there are a lot of different sign languages around the world, and I wanted to make sure to convey this so whoever was reading, who might have a background as a person who is deaf or hard of hearing or knowing sign language, could relate. So I don't have any specific signs like A is for apple. I don't have anything like that, because apple in American Sign Language is this, but it might be another sign in British Sign Language, or Auslan, which is the Australian Sign Language. So what I did is I talked about them using hand shapes or hand movements, meaning what it is. And I kind of have that as the introduction when Marguerite is first learning sign language at about the 25% mark of the book. That's when she starts learning this language that had been kept from her. And then when she starts learning sign language, then I just have in the dialogue tag, instead of saying he said, it would be he signed, or I signed, or they signed. So I don't have to have the hand movement and basically the stage direction of how they're doing it. I can just, because once she knows sign language, she's understanding what they're saying. There is a point, however, when she's at an abbey that's kind of like a deaf school or school for the deaf, where the other students and staff are all using sign language, but their native language in that area is a different root language. So instead of her Valonian language, they're using a different one as the base. It's the same sign language, but when they're mouthing their words, it's a different shape. So, and she's also a new learner. So she's trying to follow what they're saying. And so there's points where she's seeing some words, but not others. And in those situations, as well as when she's using her hearing aids, which are magical silver hair combs, I have places where you have the dialogue and then ellipses, the three dots, which are like gaps. And then it'll have another phrase and then another phrase with these gaps in between, because that is similar to how I experience it as someone who's hard of hearing, where I miss things or I might misunderstand and I'm trying to piece together the conversation. And people who are lip reading, they're not getting 100% of the message. They're filling in the gaps. And so both with signed language and with speaking and lip reading, if someone turns away or you can't see it or whatever, I want to make sure it's clear that this is not 100% communication. There's gaps. There's places where the communication breaks down.
Okay. This is intriguing. Why did you write this book?
Well, it basically is full of all the happy things that I love. Yes, there's going to be hardship and problems and bad guys, but I started writing 13 years ago when my last child was born and I went through severe postpartum depression. And so writing was a place for me to find joy. So this book is full of all the happy things I love. So it's sign language and it's princesses and it's magic and it's embroidery and it's all these wonderful things, but it's also telling a story that I love. I love happily ever afters. I love characters who have to learn and grow, face troubles, and get the strength and experience and courage to be able to face them and triumph. And that's what I wanted to write.
Okay. Disability, I think, in any of the arts, such as acting or, in your case, writing, is very rare. And I've got to assume that disability in fantasy has got to even be rarer. So can you tell us what is out there, and what shall we expect, or what do you hope to expect as an author in this field?
That's a really great question. What I have noticed is just over the last 10 years, there has actually been a lot more that I've been seeing. So recently, a really popular book that's come out is Iron Widow, and it's a YA fantasy. It's a little darker than mine. Okay. Mine's not quite so dark, but it has a character who's from a Chinese heritage. That's kind of the background for the fantasy, and her feet had been broken. And so throughout the story, her inability to walk is a part of her story and part of the source of her anger. And so, and there's other wonderful books that are out there. There's a lot more autistic representation, deaf, blind, all sorts of neurodiverse characters that we're seeing a lot more of in fantasy as well as contemporary fiction. It's really exciting.
Okay, well, I'm assuming then, based on, as an expert in this area, then we could probably within the next 10 years see an even bigger explosion in the literature.
I would expect that. Right. I would expect that, yes.
Okay. At the beginning of each chapter in your book, you have definitions relating to embroidery. Could you explain that, and how would you tell the audience? Yeah.
Oh, I had so much fun with this. I had finished the book by the time I thought of this idea, and I was like, oh, this will be so fantastic. I love embroidery, and there are some people in my age group that do, but I've noticed that the older generation, my mother's and grandmother's generation, many of them have tried to pass it on to people of my generation, and we were not interested. There was MTV, there was TV, radio, all sorts of stuff. But now my generation is starting to get into it, and the younger generation, Generation X, Y, and Z, and millennials, all of us, are starting to get into the handcrafts. And sometimes these terms and definitions aren't always there. It's just you watch a tutorial, but you may not have a name for it. So I use some of these to give hints as to what's happening in the chapter. So the first one has a definition for black work, which was popular in the medieval times, which this is kind of a Renaissance time. So it's just leaving medieval and into Renaissance period. So black work, a form of embroidery using black thread on white linen or cotton fabric. Iron-based black dye used historically is corrosive, and no known techniques can stop the decay of these threads. So with this, you can tell, okay, something's bad is going to happen, which it does. The opening chapter, something bad happens. But I also have ones such as this one, feather stitch, an open or looped stitch in which the thread is caught by the next upstitched and curved away from its natural path. So you see, there's something unexpected that's going to be happening there. But I also use some other terms like hardanger, which is a traditional Scandinavian way of doing embroidery. My mother-in-law used to do this. But when you look at it, you break it apart, it's hard and danger. And I'm like, okay, I have to put a pun in there.
Okay. If you hadn't said that, it would have slipped right past me. But yeah, that's pretty cute. Yeah.
Another one, cruel work. It's spelled C-R-E-W-E-L for cruel. But there's something cruel, C-R-U-E-L, that happens.
Well, I am impressed with that, if the word is ingenious way of using those terms for your book. So that's really got to be even whet the reader's appetite even more.
Well, I hope so.
Yes.
I think that embroidery is fun. There's a lot of handcrafts that are out there. I walk into Joann's or Michael's or one of these craft stores and I thought, oh, I'm just overwhelmed. There's so many things you can do, but there's so much fun that can be found there, and especially in our stressful times, it's a great way for anxiety relief and just to be able to have some mindfulness, and I really enjoy it.
Okay. Going back to the Marguerite being deaf, did you, in your manuscripts, did you let people who are 100% deaf read your manuscripts to say, no, a deaf person would never do that, or this is not the way we as deaf people would? Did you have people who are deaf look at your manuscripts just to make sure it sounded accurate?
So I did have some sensitivity readers who looked through portions of it that I wasn't as certain about, that I wanted to make sure I got it right. Because it is such a long manuscript and it's a lot to demand. I didn't ask anyone to read the whole thing, but I also talked through some of the issues with some of my friends who are deaf, and we would discuss that. So I have several. I have a lot of deaf friends, but I have several who I thought I could go to and ask specific questions for. So it might be one person for one thing and one person for another. So that's been a really great resource for me.
Well, I ask that in a way because I have diabetes, and I don't know how many times I've seen on television, at least, where they get the wrong terminology or the wrong diagnosis for what they should be treating the person who has diabetes. I'm thinking, didn't you hire a medical expert to examine this? And so I figured, listening to you, I thought you probably had some help just to make sure that everything is accurate, because you don't want to get really bad criticism, that sort of thing.
Exactly, yes. And I think it's also helpful that I have a background in, I went to UA Little Rock, and I got my bachelor's degree there a few years ago as an interpreter for deaf and hearing, to make sure I could be a bridge, so to speak. And in that, we had deaf culture, a class, like a semester all about deaf culture. We had ones that are about the breakdown of the different pieces and parts of like the hand shape, like which way you would do it. Some signs, you're using this sign, but this is bacon and this is lasagna. So, which one are you doing? So you have to know hand shapes, hand positions, because how you have it might be different. So being able to have that deep dive into sign language has helped me a lot, and being able to be in the deaf community has been helpful. So I feel like I did already have a pretty good background, but I wanted to double check.
Okay. Now, many of our viewers are would-be authors, and they're really interested in knowing how can I get my book published. How did you find your publisher? What was it like working with your publisher, especially in this sort of, to me, very rare, unique genre, especially with disability? Because, and I'm not making fun of the publishing industry, but they want to make money. And so tell us what your experience was, and maybe any recommendations you have for potential authors of any field.
That's a really good question. I have been trying to query this novel for almost 5 years. Now, 5 years ago, it wasn't in very good shape, and it wasn't ready for publication. It needed to go through quite a few changes. But I went through querying with various literary agents, several different times when I thought the book was ready, and I got a lot of rejections. The rejections changed over the years to much more positive, saying this is a great book, but I just don't think I'm the right person. And I did approach a couple of smaller publishing houses, and one of them worked with disability and fantasy. It's called Mythos and Ink. It's a Canadian publisher, and the editor there, Alison Alexander, she actually wrote a book about, it's called Super Sick, and it's about fantasy and disability and her experience, and she gave me a lot of good feedback, but in the end it wasn't accepted for publication, which is fine because it needed some more work, so I did more work on it. But in the end, what happened when I was just about ready to put it away in 2020, I saw a Twitter pitch contest on Twitter, and it was from a new publishing house called Sword and Silk. And they had done a Kickstarter campaign, and it's owned by 2 authors who had had some bad experiences in publishing and whose publishers had not treated them very well. And they were like, we want to do better. Let's make it better. And we want to have it female oriented, about good, strong women making a difference in their communities and in the world. And so I pitched them, just a few characters on Twitter, and a month later they said, send us 50 pages. So I sent that off, and then a few months later I heard back, they said, send us the whole thing. So I sent it off, and they got back with me just over a year ago, January of 2021, and they said, we would love to publish this. So it's a small publisher. It's different than the big 5. It's a different pathway. I didn't need a literary agent for this publisher, which if you're going with the big 5 or a lot of traditional publishers, you do need to have a literary agent. Okay. I still don't have one. I'd love to get one. But in this case, it worked out well, and I've had a really good experience. We went through the editing process, finding a really great cover artist for the book, which I was very pleased with. And they've done a really great marketing campaign. So I've been really pleased. There's a small publisher, but they covered everything that was important to me. Okay. Oh, and they're doing book boxes. They did
Explain what that term is.
Oh, it's so much fun. If you're into YA books, you have to know about book boxes. So there's a lot of companies out there that you have a monthly subscription, and you will get these boxes with 1 or 2 books, and then lots of little goodies and gifties and candles and stuff like that come with it. But the publisher themselves is doing that, and they did it as part of their Kickstarter campaign when they started. And so the first group of people who funded their operation would have a guaranteed book box for the first 5 books they publish, and I'm number 5.
Oh, congratulations.
So I know, it was so great. So they're going to have a candle that's scented like Valonia and Marguerite's World, and then some other fun things in there. So it's exciting. And that once they told me that, I'm like, okay, where do I sign? Because book boxes, I love.
Is the book being published as we speak?
Yes,
okay.
it is.
So when can the audience expect to see the book? When if they place an order online or whatever, when could they expect to get an actual physical copy of the book?
They can get it within the next few days. I have friends who pre-ordered and have ordered over the weekend, and they've been able to get it. And I have other friends who've gone into Barnes & Noble and picked it up. So it is local. I signed a few copies at the Little Rock Barnes & Noble last weekend. Okay. So they had, I don't know if they still have any copies, but they did a few days ago.
Okay, well then keep that in mind, audience. All right. What can we expect in your next work?
Well, I want to stay in the disability lane. I think that that's something that I can explore a little bit further. So I have a contemporary novel that I have done, and I've revised it a few times, so we'll see where it's at in a few months. But it's about a girl who's she's actually deaf, deaf with a lowercase d, meaning she's not culturally deaf. She doesn't use sign language a lot in her normal everyday life. She's raised by hearing parents. She doesn't go to deaf school. But over the course of the book, she learns to accept her deaf identity when there's some problems in her family, and her dad, who has been pushing her to be more normal and hide her hearing aid and try to speak all the time and lip read and kind of fake it. When there's some problems in the family, it starts to fracture, and some of the things that the dad has been pushing start to ring false. And so she starts learning sign language again she left off from the time she was about 5. But it's through her love of fencing, sword play.
Yes.
Yes, I took some fencing classes here in Little Rock a few years ago, and I loved it. So I thought I'd bring another favorite into the book. So it's a contemporary about a fencing girl and learning sign language, and I love it. And then I have another fantasy in mind that I'm working on. It's still in the drafting stages, but the key idea is Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know if you've ever played it or anything.
I've never played it, but I know what you're talking about.
My boys are really into it. So an NPC character is a non-playing character. That's someone who you buy your stuff from or who might be in the tavern. Well, my idea was, what if an NPC character with a disability goes on an adventure? Someone who's not supposed to go because they're too broken to be able to go, but they go on an adventure. So I have a pair of them. A girl who is, who makes all sorts of things and sells them to the adventurers, and she is low vision. And then I have a hard of hearing, son of the most famous explorer in the world, and he has a need for her help, and they end up going on this adventure through a haphazard series of events where they shouldn't be where they are, but they're gonna make it through. And it's a lot of fun. I'm having so much fun drafting it.
It's so funny. This is my own vanity speaking, but you said you're putting fencing in, something that another one of your favorites in your next book. I'm hoping that after this interview, I become one of your favorites and I end up in one of your future books.
We'll have to have a character named Derek in one of the next books. All right, okay.
And it's spelled D-E-R-E-K.
Okay, I'm gonna write it in my notes and I'm gonna see if we can find a space for you.
Yeah. Well, I told a potential author, even if you name a dog Derek, and she did. It was never published, but she named the dog Derek and just showed it to me, blah, blah, blah. But I just thought I'd throw that in there because that's really exciting. Okay, why don't you at this point, why don't we segue and let you read a section of your book for the audience?
Okay.
All right.
I'll go ahead and read a portion from the beginning. The opening is...
we have 2 minutes.
We have 2 minutes. All right, I'll keep it short. So this is when there's a witch trial going on, and the witches are being brought in, and Marguerite is sitting with the rest of the Abbey girls, and they have to watch it, and they have to basically illustrate it through thread on their embroidery hoops. The folk grow rowdy until the Abbey bells chime terce hour. The crowd quiets. My stomach flips. There have been burnings in a few villages since the edict passed, but this is the first in the Clare Valley, the first I must witness. The Moir brethren from St. Clotilde lead 4 manacled women onto the raised platform. I shudder as the clergymen jostle the women into a line. Stained dresses, once pretty, hang on 2 slender bodies. There are books in my grandfather's library with theories that starving a witch takes her power. It's a backward logic that accidentally lands on truth, and those books have migrated from the library to my uncle's chambers. Did he direct his men to only feed these women enough to keep them alive while his magistrates searched for evidence? Someone did. Men seem to find starvation a natural precaution to panicked, desperate magic. Isabeau elbows me. Stop staring. She always sits to my left so I can hear her. Isabeau's 17, a year older than I. When we were younger, I pretended she was my sister. She's tall, with hair straight as a mason's plumb line, yet we look more alike than not. Brown eyes, freckles, and dark hair. I've trusted her since my first day at the Abbey. I'd lined up with the others, but missed when a novice gave instructions. Offended at my inattention, the novice grabbed my ear, pulling me towards the door, stating that the Norns didn't need a crippled deaf girl. She tasted Isabeau's fist before they were both informed that the crippled deaf girl was the princess. Isabeau avoided trouble thereafter, apart from our clandestine puppet shows after lights out, and regularly misplacing her embroidery needles. Her current needle darts around the nearly complete central image. My stomach curls at the suggestion of figures tied to the pillory, all nearly engulfed by the stitched outlines of flames. He's not past judgment, I whisper. Though the women will not be found innocent, it seems wrong to illustrate their deaths before it happens. Isabeau returns to her needlework without reply, for the thread mistress swoops before us. A lovely scene, Princess Marguerite. She overshapes her words as she points to the empty center. Only the witches left to add. Solemn drumming saves me from answering. More gray-clad brethren proceed into the town square. Behind the clerics march the abbot of St. Clotilde and the Lord Mayor of Tilreux. I hunch at the sight of the man marching shoulder to shoulder between them. My uncle Richard, Bishop Princeps of Wallonia. The bad guy.
All right, as we finish, do you have any social media that the audience could contact you by?
Yes, I am active on Twitter and on Instagram, and I started on TikTok a couple of weeks ago, and I'm still getting my bearings, but I have a few fun videos out there with book quotes and stuff, so it's fun. My handle is at Amelia Loken. It's pretty easy. My name.
Could you do that in sign?
Sure. So at and then AMELIALOKEN. My name.
All right.
And just so you know, my sign name is Amelia Loken. So it's the A and the L right by the corner of my smile.
Well, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much. All right.
You're welcome. I'm so happy to be here.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today. If you're interested in reading more from Ms. Loken, please visit us at the library or find us online at our website, laymanlibrary.org. Please join us again next time. Have a great day, everyone.